Roughly a third of the world's adults can drink a glass of milk without any consequence. The other two-thirds physically can't process it properly. That split isn't cultural. It isn't about preference or upbringing. It's genetic, written directly into the DNA of some populations and absent from others. And it happens to be one of the fastest spreading mutations in recent human history. Here's what most people don't know. This divide didn't go unnoticed by the people living through it. Roman writers, centuries before anyone understood genetics, kept describing a strange pattern among the populations north of their empire. Julius Caesar wrote about it. So did Tacitus. So did Pliny the Elder. Independently, repeatedly, across different authors and different decades, they kept fixating on the exact same detail. Certain barbarian peoples drank milk constantly, as adults, in quantities the Romans found almost repulsive. They thought they were describing bad taste, cultural backwardness. What they were actually recording, without knowing it, was one of the most significant genetic changes in recent human evolution, caught mid-transition, by people who had no idea what they were looking at. To understand what those Roman writers stumbled onto, you need to understand what's actually supposed to happen to the human body after infancy. Every mammal produces an enzyme called lactase during childhood, which is what allows a nursing infant to digest the lactose in milk. And in the ancestral default version of human biology, that enzyme production shuts down once weaning is complete. Permanently. The body simply stops making it, on the assumption that milk is no longer going to be part of the diet. That's still true for most adult humans alive today. It's also true for essentially every other adult mammal on the planet. A grown cat, a grown dog, a grown lion, none of them can properly digest lactose either, which is why giving an adult cat a bowl of milk is a good way to upset its stomach, not do it a favor. What makes a subset of humans different is a genetic mutation that overrides that shutdown. In people who carry it, lactase production simply never stops. The enzyme keeps being made into adulthood, old age, an entire lifetime, allowing something that, biologically speaking, almost nothing else on Earth can do past infancy. Drink milk, digest it fully, and feel completely fine. The Roman writers who documented this had no concept of enzymes or mutations. What they had was a strong opinion, repeated often enough to leave a real paper trail. When Julius Caesar campaigned into Britain, he wrote with visible distaste about how much milk the local population consumed, treating it as a marker of how uncivilized they were. Strabo, writing as a geographer and historian, singled out the Celts for the same habit, framing their fondness for dairy as further proof of their inferiority to Roman culture. Tacitus, describing the tribes of Germania, specifically called out their taste for curdled milk, listing it alongside other traits he considered crude. Pliny the Elder went further, describing butter itself as, in his words, the food of choice among barbarian tribes, a comment dripping with condescension from a culture that mostly avoided both milk and butter entirely. There's a practical reason the Romans didn't share this habit, beyond simple taste. The Mediterranean climate made fresh milk spoil quickly, so Roman cuisine leaned toward aged cheese instead, something that kept far longer in the heat. But that practical difference hardened into something closer to an ethnic stereotype. To a Roman writer, heavy milk consumption wasn't just a regional habit. It became shorthand for otherness, for a kind of primitive, uncultured way of living, distinct from the refined wine and olive oil diet Rome preferred to associate with itself. This wasn't a passing observation unique to Roman writers either. Push the timeline back further, and the same detail keeps resurfacing. Homer, writing centuries before Rome existed as a power worth mentioning, already described the peoples living north of the Black Sea using a specific, memorable epithet. He called them the mare milkers, a direct reference to their reliance on milk from horses rather than cattle. Herodotus, writing his histories not long after, picked up the same thread and expanded on it. He described the Scythians, the nomadic peoples of the Eurasian steppe, using almost identical language, milk drinkers, and went into specific detail about how they processed it. According to his account, they had developed a method of agitating mare's milk using blind slaves to produce something closer to fermented butter or cheese. A detail specific enough that it reads less like rumor and more like something an observer actually watched happen. What's notable isn't just that ancient writers mention milk. It's that this exact detail, adults consuming large quantities of animal milk as a defining feature of a population, kept getting singled out. Across centuries, across completely different authors, in completely different regions. That kind of consistency isn't coincidence. It's a pattern real enough that multiple independent observers couldn't help but notice it. Here's the part none of those writers could have possibly understood. They weren't just describing a cultural preference that happened to cluster in certain regions. They were describing the visible downstream effect of a genetic split that was still actively spreading through the human population while they were writing about it. Populations that had spent generations herding cattle, sheep, or horses, and depending heavily on dairy for survival, were gradually accumulating a mutation that let them keep digesting milk into adulthood. Populations without that same deep herding history mostly weren't. The result, visible on the ground without any need for a microscope, was exactly the pattern Roman and Greek writers kept independently stumbling onto. Certain groups drank milk constantly and seemed completely unbothered by it. Others didn't, because for most of their population, drinking it in any real quantity came with consequences. What looked to Roman eyes like a strange cultural habit, worth mocking in a few passing sentences, was actually a live, mid-progress genetic divergence between human populations. They were watching evolution happen in real time. They just filed it under bad manners instead. The mutation responsible for all of this sits in a surprisingly unglamorous location. It's not even inside the lactase gene itself, called LCT. It sits nearby, in a neighboring gene called MCM6, in a stretch of DNA that normally just regulates when LCT gets switched on and off. A single change in that regulatory region, a swap of one genetic letter for another at a specific position researchers now label T-13910, is enough to override the default shutdown. Instead of lactase production quietly ending after weaning, this one variant keeps the gene active indefinitely. It's a strikingly small change to produce such a large effect. One letter, in one regulatory switch, is the entire genetic difference between someone who can drink a glass of milk without a second thought and someone who can't. And critically, this wasn't the ancestral human condition. It's the exception, not the rule. The original default version of the human genome, the one nearly everyone carried for most of our species' history, shuts lactase production down, the same way it does in virtually every other adult mammal on Earth. Somewhere in the last several thousand years, a small number of people picked up a variant that broke that rule, and instead of staying rare, it spread fast and unevenly across specific parts of the world. For a long time, this entire history was theoretical, pieced together from modern genetic data and educated guesswork about the past. Then researchers started pulling DNA directly out of ancient skeletons, and the theory became something closer to direct evidence. One study analyzed genetic material recovered from Neolithic burial sites, human remains going back thousands of years, from populations already known to be raising cattle and actively consuming dairy products. If the assumption that milk drinking drove the mutation's spread were straightforwardly true, you'd expect at least some of these early dairying farmers to already carry it. They didn't. The DNA extracted from these skeletons showed the ancestral version of the gene, over and over. These were people actively producing and consuming milk products, cheese, likely some form of yogurt, as a real part of their diet and economy, while remaining, genetically, unable to properly digest lactose as adults. That finding on its own reshaped how researchers think about this trait. It meant people were drinking milk, and presumably dealing with the digestive consequences, for a very long stretch of time before the mutation that would have made it comfortable ever showed up. The behavior came first. The biology that would eventually make that behavior painless came later and took its own time catching up. So if early dairy farmers weren't carrying the mutation, where did it actually come from? And when? Genetic dating techniques have narrowed the answer down with surprising precision. The T-13910 variant appears to have first emerged in the region of modern-day Ukraine, close to 6,000 years ago. For a while after that, it likely stayed relatively contained, a local variant in a specific population, not yet the widespread trait it would eventually become. Then, starting somewhere between 4,000 and 3,500 years ago, it began moving. Fast. Genetic evidence traces its spread across an enormous stretch of territory, from what's now Spain all the way to Kazakhstan, in a pattern that lines up closely with a documented wave of migration by steppe populations moving out of the Pontic-Caspian region and across Eurasia. Wherever these groups settled, the mutation appears to have traveled with them, and in Europe specifically, its frequency kept climbing sharply for centuries afterward. By the time Caesar, Tacitus, and the others were writing their observations, this process had already been running for well over 1,000 years. What they were seeing wasn't the beginning of the story. It was somewhere in the middle of it, a trait that had already spread far enough to become visibly, distinctly regional, but was still nowhere near universal. Here's where the story stops being tidy, and where current researchers admit they genuinely don't have a complete answer. If heavy dairy dependence is what drove this mutation to spread, you'd expect it to show up reliably in any population with a long, deep history of relying on milk for survival. It doesn't. Central Asian herders are a striking exception. These are populations whose entire way of life, for thousands of years, has revolved around dairy from horses, camels, sheep, and goats. Milk isn't a minor part of their diet. It's central to it, and has been for an extraordinarily long time. And yet genetic surveys consistently find that most of these populations remain lactose intolerant as adults, carrying the same ancestral version of the gene that shuts lactase production down after weaning. They've solved the problem a different way, mostly through fermentation, turning milk into products like fermented mare's milk, where much of the lactose has already been broken down before it's consumed. But the genetic shortcut that Europeans and some African and Middle Eastern populations evolved never took hold there, despite what should have been, by the logic of natural selection, exactly the right conditions for it. Researchers are still actively debating why. It remains one of the more stubborn open questions in human evolutionary genetics, sitting right in the middle of a story that otherwise looks fairly straightforward. So when you go back and reread Caesar's disdain, or Tacitus dismissing curdled milk as beneath civilized taste, what you're actually looking at is a written record of a genetic line being drawn in real time by people who thought they were making an observation about manners. The Romans weren't wrong that something set those populations apart. They just had no way of knowing what that something actually was. Not culture, not character. A single altered letter in a regulatory gene, spreading unevenly across Eurasia over thousands of years, sorting populations into those who could drink milk for life and those who couldn't, long before anyone had the language to describe genes at all. That split is still with us today, roughly the same fault line, still running through the modern world in almost the same geography Caesar and Tacitus wrote about. Next time you see it argued that history and biology run on separate tracks, remember this: sometimes the historians got the story right, thousands of years before the scientists showed up to explain why.